Hello. I'm sorry. I feel a little embarrassed by this. I'm just a grunt for Jesus. That's all. Military grunt for Jesus. So, thank you, Father, for the intro. But I'm here to introduce Steve Rasche, who is going to be speaking. And I just wanted to say that first, Steve has been working with Iraq for several years. But I'll go back a little bit. I first met Archbishop Warda, and when I was taking part of a medical missionary group in 2014. And I remember when I first met the Archbishop, he shared with me that one morning he woke up in August, I think, of 2014, and the streets were just filled with refugees. So they had to gear up and do some work. There was so much to do. So in Iraq, the Archdiocese of Erbil has become responsible for food, shelter, education, medical care of over 100,000 displaced Christians who have fled their homes in the face of the ISIS genocide. Archbishop Warda was the rock of service that helped these people together. And without his efforts in 2014 and 15, most observers agree that the displaced Christians would nearly have fled Iraq at that time. In December of 2014, after Steve had joined Archbishop's team in Iraq, the Archbishop sent him to D.C. for a time to gain friends and support of their work. And Steve had stepped away from a private practice job, law practice, to serve as a full-time missionary. And in many ways, he had entered into the world of poverty common to us missionaries who work. Though he's been no stranger to Iraq, he had done commercial work back in Iraq in 2007 and had made many friends in the Christian community there. But the call for full-time missionary service was something new for him. Before leaving for D.C., Archbishop Warda had told Steve to contact me, and we would be able to try to help him. So Steve reached out, and we Little Workers of the Sacred Heart, our little community in D.C., adopted him. And we opened up our kitchen table and turned it into his office. And if you know our community, we basically are food pushers. So we would just feed him, push him food, and let him work and do all this work that I was so impressed with what he was doing. I had no clue, but we just knew that in our little way we could be helping Steve, who was helping Archbishop, who was helping our brothers and sisters in Iraq. That was about 5 years ago, and since then I've watched him work, and that the Archdiocese has, as they persevere, pray, and serve through many rejections and failures, and occasionally, thanks be to God, some successes. And much of this story is told in Steve's book, which I read, and it's a very easy read and very good book, and I encourage you all to read it. In this time of global and national confusion and turmoil, it will be easy for the world to forget the Christians of Iraq and in the Middle East. But as Christians, we are all called to take the long view, to plant our seeds as a culture of life, of forgiveness, and of love. Within the continued violence of the Middle East, this Christian culture of life stands apart and shows a path still not just for the people of those lands, but for the greater world overall. We're really blessed that Archbishop Warda and Steve are here to tell their story to you today, and I hope that you will come away with some inspiration as to what is still possible in this life and what our church can still be when we truly dedicate ourselves to God's service. Thank you, and God bless you all.
So I'd like to thank you all for being here today, and I'd like to thank Bishop Burbidge and Father Hathaway and Father David for putting this all together, and all the other people that worked so hard along the way to have this in the middle of all this this difficult time. I'd like to thank as well Sister Dee for introducing me, for coming out in all of this. Sister Dee told you a little bit about our story together, and I'll just say this, you know, I was a 50-something-year-old lawyer when I showed up on Sister Dee Dee's door for the first time, and I thought I knew some things in life, but I never knew fortitude and perseverance until I met Sister Dee Dee, not in the way that she taught it to me. And I'll just tell you a quick story here before we go on further. I remember in that first year, you know, I'd been to Iraq, and we had looked at what needed to be done, which was everything, and we looked at the kind of help that we needed, which was everything, and we looked at the kind of support that we had, which was nothing. And the bishop said, go back to the U.S. and find some people who will help us. I said, okay, not really sure where we're going to get, but I'll go back there and let's see what we can find out. And he said, go see Sister Dee Dee, she'll help us. And so I did, and in that first year, that winter, I remember specifically one day I had reached out to a gentleman in the world of Catholic business leaders, who's a very well-placed person, and we thought that that might be a good place to begin. And so he took our story, which was, you know, we have 100,000 odd Christian displaced people. We're trying to open up a university so they can continue their studies in the displacement. We're trying to build a hospital so that we can have an anchor institution, and in the middle of it, we're trying to provide housing, food, and medical care for all of these people. And so can you please contact people in the business community here in the U.S. and see who can help. And so he did, and we came back, and we had coffee in the cafeteria of the Basilica, the National Shrine, right up there by CUA, and we had coffee there. And his answer to me was, well, Steve, I'm really sorry to tell you this. I've talked to everybody I know, and the answer is we don't want to invest in this, and we don't know anybody who would. So that was 2015, and I remember going back to the convent of the Little Sisters and talking to Sister Dee Dee about it, and she said, well, it'll be all right. We'll just pray on it, keep working. And you know, I would spend time with them, with the sisters, and I would see how they would never give up. They would never give up. They would never be dissuaded. They would continue their mission. And I learned that from her. And, you know, 5 years later, I'm happy to say we opened our hospital, we opened our university. You'll see more on that later in the presentation today. Our university is now fully accredited within the Ministry of Higher Education. And just about 4 or 5 months ago, we became recipients of one of the very first recipients from USAID for a major grant from the New Partners Initiative. And just this week, we've received a $1 million contract from the State Department to engage in capacity building projects as well. So, you know, we came from all that distance of darkness and into a place where we're still there. And I have to say, the message, the teaching of perseverance and fortitude that I learned from my time with the sisters is something that I'll just treasure with me for the rest of my days. It really stuck with me. So with that, I'm going to give you a quick outline of what I'm going to talk about here. You guys have been great to sit through all of this. I know this is a tough subject, It's not one for the faint-hearted. So I'm going to try to not overly address all the difficulty. We'll show you a video. It speaks for itself. You've heard about how difficult these situations are. We're going to touch on that a little bit, but then I'm going to also show you what comes out of these times of persecution and what still can be built out of it. So with that, we're going to run this video. This video is about 15 minutes long, and what it is, it's a compilation of vignettes from the time of the ISIS war and how it impacted the Christian refugees and displaced people, what their lives were like from the beginning to the end as it comes out. And then after the video, I'll join you back in and we'll talk. At the end there, you couldn't tell quite so well in this light, but what that was, those are the sisters who ran the orphanage, and there were about a dozen young orphaned girls, and they were dancing. They had gone out to have an evening picnic, and they were dancing, and it's one of the things that really struck me about the Iraqis as a whole, and specifically the Iraqi Christians and the Iraqi Christians within the church that I lived and worked with, is that if you got 2 or 3 of them together, within 3 minutes they were laughing. In the midst of all of this unending war and tribulation, it took 3 minutes for them to be laughing and finding some joy in life. And so that's what that scene was at the end. They said, let's go out tonight. We'll go up to the top of the mountain and we'll have a picnic and dance. So that's what that was. So as we move into this discussion, again, you folks have seen over the course of last night and today quite a bit of the physical side of persecution. I don't know that there's that much more that I have to add to it. The Iraqi experience, the Iraqi Christian experience from the physical side of persecution is much the same as what you've seen in these other countries. And it's a brutal, violent thing. We have many videos and photos of the brutality, of the violence. But I think that you've all got that message. What I do want to talk to you about, though, is a thing that you saw some of in this video that I think is of specific note for us here in the U.S. in the West today, and that's the desecration that you've seen. In the video, you saw some cuts there from the churches as we entered them right after ISIS. All of those cuts that you saw of the condition of those churches were taken within 24 to 48 hours after ISIS had been removed from those towns. And in some cases, they were still on the outskirts or on other parts of the towns when we moved in. And I was with a small group of priests, and it was our role to document things as we went into the town for all sorts of reasons, both for future justice issues, but also so we could have a documentary evidence of what the condition was of the churches to forestall any looting or anything like that might go on. So those pictures that you see are what ISIS left behind in those churches, and in particular, the burning of the churches, the beheading of the statues of the Virgin Mary and Joseph and the saints and whatnot. And I mention that because for anybody who's paying attention and watching what's going on in the West, in Europe, now with increasing familiarity here, unfortunately, in the U.S., is the same type of thing. And there's a tendency to simply say, well, these are just one-off, these are just vandals, these are things that are not really thought out. I disagree. I've spent nearly 6 years of my life in a country where these things were intentional, where they built up over time, and they lead someplace. These are not farewell gestures. These are not juvenile pranks. These are deliberate calling cards, and they're promises of things to come. And I think that what's happening here in the U.S. as we look at these things, that the people of faith, and even people who are not of faith, but people who are of simple human decency and courtesy, we have to stand up to this. These incidents that are occurring every other day now in this country need to be stood up to, and people need to comment on them. The media could care less about it, but people of faith decent, courteous people in this country need to say something about that, because it leads someplace. It's a calling card, and at the end of the road is nothing good. So, moving on from there, one of the other forms of persecution that has become really clear to me over these last 5 or 6 years is the accepted forms of complicity in the West, in the U.S., that allows persecution to continue. And that's a thing that's real, and it's a thing that continues, and people are not called on it. I'm going to give you here just 3 pertinent examples. So these are recent examples, and I think they speak for themselves. The first of these is just recently, the BBC broadcast a 5-part series on the history of Iraq since 2003. It's entitled "The Life and Times in Iraq," and it's on BBC, but it's also being broadcast, or was broadcast a couple months ago, on PBS Frontline. And when it first came out, when the BBC first started filming it, they said this will be the definitive account of what happened to the people on the ground. Fair enough. It's a story that needs to be told. When the final story was put together and all the edits were finished and all of the whole program had been put together, lo and behold, at the end of it, there was no persecution or genocide against Christians or Yazidis. In fact, there were no Christians or Yazidis in this story at all, in a 5-hour documentary. They didn't exist. 2 groups of people that have been victims of genocide and acknowledged genocide, which has almost left them extinct. And yet, in a production by the BBC, later broadcast and pared down by Frontline, PBS Frontline, these 2 groups of religious minorities don't exist. They're just not there. You might say, well, okay, well, that's just one bad example. That's really unfortunate. Just last week, the Brookings Institute published its Iraq Index for 2020, and in that Iraq Index, which they put out, I think, every year for the last 15, 20 years, there are a number of graphs intending to deal with what the situation is on the ground. And so one of these graphs is on the feeling of safety in Iraq. There was a question on that, and the question is, do you feel safe in Iraq? And so there's a very well-done professional graph, and there's one graph for the Sunni Muslims, there's one graph for the Shia Muslims, the end. There is no graph for the Christians, there is no graph for the Yazidis. The Brookings Institution has an annual budget of $120 million and some pretty smart people there. And yet the Christians and Yazidis, again, both people, religious minorities in Iraq, acknowledged victims of a horrific genocide, don't exist. Don't exist. Bring one more example. This is just from last week, September 8th, 2020. The Watson Institute at Brown University and the Boston University Pardee Center put out a joint report, a 30-page report entitled Creating Refugees, Displacement Caused by the U.S. Post-9/11 Wars. And in that 30-page report, much of which has to deal with the situation in Iraq and the displacement caused there, again, the Christians and Yazidis do not exist. They're simply not there. So how does that happen? How does that happen? I think these are questions that need to be asked, and no doubt that if you go to these institutes and you go to these organizations, which are filled with smart people and big budgets, they're going to have an answer for it. I submit that it's probably not an answer that should be accepted, and they need to be called on it. These are just 3 examples, but this happens all the time, all the time. And so there it does reach a point at which when these genocides are going on, when this oppression is going on, when this persecution is going on, where does the silence of the West become complicit? So those are things I really would encourage you to think about and pay attention to. The next time you hear news about Iraq, look for it and say, well, are there Christians in there? Are there Yazidis in there? Is anybody telling their story? Because if they're not, it's not a story of Iraq. So, in terms of the situation, beyond all of that, beyond the issue of the persecution, both the complicit persecution and the physical persecution itself, I wanted to talk to you about my experience and the things that I learned while I was in Iraq, while I've been working there in Iraq, to see to what extent those might have value for any of you. And the first of those is that persecution as Christians, it's not a new thing for us. We know from the teachings of Christ and Matthew, blessed are you when they revile and persecute you. It's not a new thing. And my observation is that out of persecution comes perseverance, comes fortitude, and most importantly comes a clarity of mission. And you'll see some of this again when the Archbishop speaks. But for the Christians of Iraq now, what is that mission? Having had their faith, having had their culture, having had their religion almost taken from them, violently so, they made a decision that they wouldn't accept that. And they are still there, and now with a missionary purpose. And that missionary purpose is to say to the world, to the rest of Iraq, and to themselves, that we have a reason to be here. We have a purpose to be here. And that purpose to being here is to live out the witness of our faith. And I'll give you just one quick example of that. In this month's issue of the magazine, The Plow. I don't know if any of you have seen The Plow before, but I highly recommend it. We have an article in there this month. It's entitled Iraq's Christians Bearing Witness. And just one quick little snippet from there. There's a scene in there in which I relay. We are driving out to the town of Batnaya. It's one of the blown-up towns that we'd been working in 2016 and 2017. And I was in the car in the pickup truck with one of the priests, Father Salar, and we said, "What are we going to do here?" And Father Salar, I'll never forget, he said to me, "Look, our people have to forgive. We have to forgive. And we have to show to these other people that we still know how to love. And if we can't do these things, then why should we be here?" And, and what a message. What a message. We must forgive and show these others that we can still love. And these are the Iraqi victims, Iraqi Christian victims of ISIS. And I think and I pray, hopefully there's a message in there for all of the anger and the hate and the violence that we're seeing here. These people were victims of absolute genocide, real violence, and yet they're saying, it's up to us, forgive, show people that we can still love. The second thing is service, and in these years, really had a chance to reflect, not just myself, but with the priests and the sisters and all the lay people that we worked with, both in Iraq and around the world that were helping us, about what does service really mean? And I'd submit to you that service means risk. Means placing yourself at risk, and I don't necessarily mean the physical risk that comes from placing yourself in a war zone. There's all sorts of risks that are right here at home, more and more every day, but it does mean putting yourself out. Father David spoke about this a little bit earlier, about how we sometimes confuse what is prudence, and it becomes an excuse for not acting. I'll tell you a quick story here and end with this and move on to the bishop's positive message for you. In 2016 was really a dark time in Iraq. It was really unclear whether or not the war would still end. 2015. It was really an unclear situation as to whether or not the war would end, whether it would go on another 10 years. Most of the time we didn't have power. Often we didn't have water. And people were living in just atrocious situations. We were really having difficulty trying to keep up with them. And in the middle of this, there was a church service that was started. It was a once-a-week English language mass, and it was given by whichever priest, whichever English language speaking priest might be available at that time. And so it was a mishmash of Filipinos, of Indians, of Africans, of European and American NGO workers and whatnot. And it was a Catholic Mass, but basically every Christian, English-speaking Christian who was there would come. It was the only place where they could get something that was a service, and we would all sing together and pray together. And I remember in particular one service, and the reading was from Matthew 8:20. The foxes have holes, and the birds of the air have their nests, but the Son of Man has nowhere to lay his head. And this was in the middle of the war. There were helicopters flying over us every 5 minutes, and you could hear the war was not so far away. And the priest spoke to the reading, and he said, "We're in the middle of this, and it's not a good situation. But you should remember this. As Christians, we're not called to lives of comfort and security. Christ said, 'Follow me.' He wasn't saying, 'Follow me to some place that's comfortable.' He's saying, 'Follow me to some place that needs service, that needs some help.'" So those words, and that service, in terms of what my experience has been, has stayed with me. And all I can tell you is for those of you out there, I was in my early 50s, mid-50s, when I began this journey that I'm on right now. And I can tell you without question, in terms of personal vocation, the last 6 years of my work have been worth more than all the other years put together. There's service out there that needs to be done. And I think that there's a place for all of us if we can just go out and look for it. And so I would ask that, or would hope that if there's one thing that you can take away from this, is that understanding that we are in a time of desperate need everywhere you turn. There's service that needs to be done, and I pray that you will find it, because that's what we're here for. Certainly what we're here for as Christians. So with that being said, I'm going to turn it over now.